Our first speaker for today is Dr. Stephen M. Bellovin. He is the Percy K. and Vida L. W. Hodgson Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University. He's a member of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Center of the university's Data Science Institute and an affiliate faculty member at Columbia Law School. Steve does research on security and privacy and on related public policy issues. In his copious spare professional time, he does some work on the history of cryptography. He joined the faculty of Columbia University in 2005 after over 30 years at Bell Labs and AT&T Labs Research, where he was appointed as an AT&T Fellow, which is the highest honor a technical person can receive within AT&T. He received a BA degree from Columbia University and an MS and PhD in computer science from University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. While at UNC as a graduate student, Steve and two other collaborators created Usenet. In 1995, Steve and his collaborators received the Usenix Lifetime Achievement Award. Steve has also received the 2007 NIST and NSA National Computer System Security Award and has been elected to the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame. He has served as Chief Technologist of the Federal Trade Commission and as a technology scholar at the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and has served on the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. In the past, he has been a member of the Department of Homeland Security Science, Technology, and Advisory Committee and the Technical Guidelines Development Committee of the Election Assistance Commission. On a personal note, Steve was my role model when I joined Bell Labs in the 80s. He was one of the strong supporters when I proposed the creation of social.culture.african news group. For this, I'm eternally grateful. It is my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Stephen M. Bellovin. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wally. I remember those days fondly. Thank you all for inviting me to come speak here. So, we start 1988, which is approximately 35 years ago. In fact, the actual story goes back a little bit further than a year or two earlier than 1988. In May of '88, Cliff Stoll published an article in CACM called Stalking the Wily Hacker. He described how his site was hacked and how he monitored the hacker and traced him. And his book, The Cuckoo's Egg, came out in 1989. Also in '88, the first internet worm was launched. But all these problems are solved, right? Well, let's take a look back. In '86, Stoll was an astronomer working as a system administrator at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And back in those days, you charged people for computer time, just like you do today on something like AWS. And he noticed a 75-cent accounting discrepancy. Things didn't balance right because the accounting system was locally written and not known to everybody else. And that led him to find a hacker. Tracking down the hacker took almost a year. And the attacker characteristics were interesting. Penetrations were mostly happening by password compromise. There were default passwords like system and manager, field and service, guest and guest, and even open accounts with no passwords. Users shared passwords via email and stored their passwords in files. There was even password guessing, though Stoll didn't realize that until fairly late in the game. And bugs in the system were used for privilege escalation to gain root privileges. The attacker was hard to trace because of the use of stepping stones. They didn't go directly into his machine. They went into his machine from other stepping stone machines. And he tried getting various people at the administrative level, layer 9 of the network, if you will, interested. And when he went to the FBI, they said, 75-cent loss, go away, we're not interested. The CIA was interested. I thought this was fascinating. And the NSA was extremely interested. They wanted to know not just about the attacker's techniques, but how he was monitoring the attacker. And management said basically, why are you wasting your time on this? He traced the attack to Germany, wanted to get a wiretap warrant, search warrant, what have you. And German bureaucracy, law enforcement, quite properly replied that they were not going to do a sort of wiretap without a proper search warrant. And because this was a crime taking place in the US, they had to be notified properly and officially by the appropriate US government agency. I now know that would be something called an MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. But his friend's reaction, those reactions you might see today, though the FBI would probably be more interested. One of his friend's reactions were rather different. One said, so what? Someone's always had control over information. Others always tried to steal it. Read Machiavelli. As technology changes, sneakiness finds new expressions. Someone else replied, a computer system isn't private like a house. Lots of people use it for many purposes. Just because this guy doesn't have official permission to use it doesn't necessarily mean he has no legitimate purpose in being there. But Cliff himself wrote that whenever a fun-loving student breaks into systems as a game, as I might once have done, forgets that he's invading people's privacy, endangering data that others have sweated over, sowing distrust and paranoia. That's ultimately, I think, where we have come down today. And Stoll decided to try to trace the attacker. Well, he needed to keep the attacker on for long enough to actually trace. So he created what today we would call a honeypot. And since he noticed the attacker seems to be poking around for defense-related information, he created fake documents, and especially an index pointing to such documents, about the Strategic Defense Initiative, an anti-missile system popularly known at the time as Star Wars. And the attacker fell for the bait. The attacker was trying to find more such information on the system, which of course didn't exist on that computer because these documents were all fake. And somebody, probably a Soviet bloc agent, even sent a physical letter asking for more documents. Well, that actually got the FBI interested. And Stoll's analysis was that passwords were a problem. A memorable password was guessable. A random password somebody would store in a file. So either way you slice passwords, they were going to be a problem. Systems were not secure as shipped. There were these default accounts like guest and field and service and so on. And Bob Morris, who I originally met when we were together at Bell Labs, who later became chief scientist of the NSA's National Computer Security Center, was also, among his many other virtues, a pioneer in usable security. Secure computers might keep the bad guys out, but if they're so bulky that no one will use them, it won't be much progress. Cliff also noticed that people weren't installing patches, and he confronted the problem well before most other people did of how do you do responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities. And when he contacted sites from which the attacks were coming, even in 1986, long before the commercial internet, many people had already experienced problems with hackers. Most hosts were not on the internet, but dial-up modems were quite common. And attack techniques, even then, included dumpster diving and social engineering. The attackers wanted shell access and then root or equivalent access, system access at a high level. other interesting thing that happened in '88 was the internet worm. It was in fact, it was an advance over most of its successors. It was multi-platform, running on VAXs and Sun 3s. It was multi-vector, used a hole and send mail, the mail daemon, a buffer overflow in program was FingerD, password guessing, transitive trust. The payload was encrypted. It didn't do anything malicious, but it had exponential growth and clogged hosts and links. So 1988 anticipated a lot of what we're going to see in coming years and decades. And the 1990s, the big thing that happened was the World Wide Web and the commercialization of the internet. And the response at the time was firewalls. And Stoll noted in his book, securing one computer is like securing an apartment house. Probably can do it. But if you have a network of computers, that's like securing a small city. You know, my longtime friend and colleague from Bell Labs, Bill Cheswick, says like circling the wagons around the state of Montana. You can't do it. Bob Morris was trying to do it, but it was hard. But too many machines were vulnerable. They were being administered by different people. Hardening them all was too hard. We needed a scalable solution, and that was the firewall. The notion of a single gateway host for an organization wasn't new. You know, I brought that to my lab when I joined Bell Labs in '82. Security was one of my motives, though far from the only one. But a lot of people were thinking about single gateway hosts. The first modern packet filter was done by Jeff Mogul and colleagues in 1989. Deborah Estrin and Gene Sutik had cryptographic network access control in '89. Bill Cheswick did an application firewall in 1990. And when Bill and I wrote the first book on internet security in '94, we came up with more or less, call it a theory of firewalls. And around that time, with the internet becoming commercial, we started seeing commercial firewalls. And why did Bill and I think that firewalls were a good idea? How central computers were vulnerable. Terminals only let read data. Well, you could export things, and there were internet connected computers. Firewalls had a smaller attack surface in today's terminology. A firewall would be administered by someone who cared about security rather than someone whose just job was to keep the system running. It was a choke point. We called it customs inspection for traffic. You could put more logging in there. But fundamentally, I viewed it as dealing with the buggy host problem. In a talk I gave in '94, I wrote that the firewalls were the network response to a host security problem. Computers were too insecure, and a firewall was a scalable solution in a way that trying to secure each of the many thousands of computers inside, say, Bell Labs was not scalable. But firewalls had their limits, and we noted them at the time. We know that firewalls would protect you against attacks at a lower level of the stack, but no protection against problems with higher level protocols, like email and web. And we knew this in '94. There was a problem in the mail system, SendMail, that if you said certain header lines, you could trigger bugs. And since our firewall was only operating at a lower level, it didn't notice these. You didn't have too much bypass of firewalls then. The technology didn't quite exist, though we realized very early on that you could create tunnels to bypass firewalls. Those are still used. The web was just beginning in '94. In fact, One of the last things we added to the book before it went to press was a few paragraphs about HTTP, and we declined a suggestion to list internet resources using this newfangled idea called the URL. Importantly, firewalls depend on topology. If there's connectivity that doesn't pass through the choke point, the firewall provides no protection. And a modern corporation has very many holes through and around its firewall. So the web came along as consumer accessible around 94. It was started a few years earlier. It made the internet accessible to ordinary users, people who weren't fond of command line FTP, for example. Consumer ISPs started to appear with no firewalls. That wasn't quite the issue because the web wasn't quite an attack vector. This was still the era of PC viruses, which were being spread by floppy disks. And then, some years after the 1988 internet worm, we saw worms starting to hit the internet. In 96, someone who went by the pseudonym of Aleph One, he's now a well-respected security expert, published an article called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It was a cookbook recipe for how to carry out buffer overflow attacks. Many new sites joined the internet. These people were very smart. The people administering the machines were very smart, but they weren't battle hardened. They didn't know what it took to guard a computer against a knowledgeable attacker. And code bases, Microsoft's and everyone else's, grew much faster than quality control. This was the beginnings of the first internet boom. And the mantra of a lot of companies seemed to be ship first, debug later. By the late 90s, many, arguably most consumer-facing companies had some presence on the web. That included financial institutions. Spammers appeared and discovered email. Many US military sites were penetrated. One penetration looked serious enough that national security personnel thought it was a foreign intelligence agency. It turned out to be teenagers from Israel and California. And the NSA was proactive. In the Operation Eligible Receiver, they showed that starting from a dial-up modem, you could get to the US power grid. I note that that's still an issue today. And because we had so many buggy hosts, it was possible to create worms that would spread very quickly. The I love you worm spread via email, which passed through most firewalls, and low-grade social engineering. Click here to see a nude picture of so-and-so. The SQL slammer worm spread via UDP. One packet, poof, you're infected. Code Red could infect a Microsoft web server, and it turned out that a lot of applications on Windows laptops installed IIS and a database server. You didn't think you were running a database server or a web server, but you were. Most of these worms had no particular goal other than, but they clogged the net, exponential growth. So badly so that the blaster worm had generated so much traffic, it blocked the CSX railroad signaling network. There was a lot more buggy code than defenders imagined. A lot of it was not stopped by firewalls. I love you is email. In those days, you didn't have virus scanning, worm scanning at their email gateways. Traveling laptops at conferences were infected and brought it home. I was at Code Red hit. I was actually at the IETF meeting in London. So I quickly coded up a little packet sniffer intrusion detection to see if anyone was going to try to attack my laptop, which was not running Windows. And yeah, I saw a lot of attacks coming from the IETF conference network. And all of these computers were going to go back home next week and infect their corporate networks. VPNs were not yet common. Family members often shared the employee's laptop. There were business-to-business links that bypassed the firewall. So one of our properties for firewalls, a topological choke point and attacks at a lower level, two of our properties no longer held. How did hackers receive training? Self-taught online resources, things like the publication, a 2600 magazine, which bills itself as the Hacker Quarterly, networking with other hackers. Probably there are other countries' intelligence agencies starting to look at this stuff, though I don't know that. The Cliff Stoll's attackers turned out to be some 20-something West Germans who were trying to find American defense documents to sell to the Stasi, the East German secret police, which would turn it over to the KGB to get money for cocaine. So there were foreign intelligence implications even in the mid to late 1980s. And in the mid 2000s, there was a phase change in attacks that it took attackers a while to catch on to. Around 2003, the destructive worms stopped happening. And there were other worms, but they didn't seem to be destructive. And no one quite understood why. The New York Times actually ran a story on this. It was high quality software, but what was its purpose? And Mikko Iponen said, it's money. And he was right. The attackers had figured out that there was money to be made from hacking. Worms that shut down the internet, it turns out, are bad for business. Besides, why waste time on joy hacking when you can profit from your skills? So how about spam? Spam was originally sent via open relays. Connect to an open SMTP relay on the internet and let it send out the spam to everybody else. Those were being closed down by this point. But there are authorized machines that could send spam. So hack the endpoint and let it send the spam. The spammers paid the hackers. So there was now a profit motive for hacking. And the market worked its magic. It was, there was now demand for hacking. Illicit, but demand. The market worked. And we started seeing online banking. And that also attracted criminals. People were logging into their banks with passwords. Phishing emails, keystroke loggers could collect those passwords. And again, email passes through most firewalls. There were drive-by downloads and buggy code. For example, it was a very popular, now thankfully gone, plug into many browsers called Flash. It was the only way to animate things in those days. It had a horrible reputation for being buggy. And you could use this to take over somebody's computer, plant a keystroke logger, get their bank password. The theoretical solution to all of this was a certificate telling you that you're at your bank's website. But the difference between theory and practice is that in theory, there is no difference, in practice, there is. The average consumer has no idea what a certificate is, at least in the cryptographic sense, and doesn't know to check for it. People didn't notice the absence of a correct certificate. Their browser would have warned them if the certificate was for somebody else, but there was no certificate at all, and people didn't notice. But things started getting better in other ways. Software quality started to improve. The Gartner Group, a major corporate consulting outfit, warned its clients to get rid of IIS, the Microsoft Web Server. And Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, who were running Microsoft at the time, saw this as an existential threat to the company. When an open source web server like Apache was more secure and preferred over one of their flagship products, that was bad. And what was going to happen to them when desktop operating systems and server operating systems follow the same path? And there's also an economic fact. The dot-com boom turned into a bust. A lot of smaller companies and startups went out of business. So there's less pressure to ship fast. There's time to get your code right, but no one, and that includes Microsoft, had time to rewrite all of the old buggy code. Microsoft put a lot of effort into securing new code, but they couldn't rewrite everything. And you needed backwards compatibility, even if sometimes the interfaces themselves were a flaw. So what you ended up with a situation where all operating systems and most applications would alert users to patches. Microsoft instituted Patch Tuesday, a scheduled release of updates to ease the load on system administrators. Yeah, sometimes there'll be a serious enough attack in the wild that they'll ship an out-of-cycle patch, but mostly they don't. Why not? Because attackers reverse engineer the patches and find new bugs that if people haven't installed this patch, then the attackers can use this knowledge that they gained by looking at the patch that Microsoft has distributed. And you can't be too quick to patch a system. Patches will brick systems or cause other serious problems. There's one release of iOS where a lot of people suddenly couldn't make phone calls anymore. Since an iPhone is nominally a phone, not being able to make a phone call is a fairly serious problem. It took about 2 days for Apple to fix that, but that sort of thing can happen. And by 2009, the militaries of the world were taking very serious notice of the internet. The internet is now part of most countries' critical infrastructure. Targets attract weapons, information attracts spies, and the militaries and intelligence agencies of the world understand this. Most notably, there was Stuxnet, which widely attributed to the NSA and Israeli intelligence unit 8200. And it seriously set back Iran's nuclear uranium centrifuge enrichment plant. And phishing grew up. It became spear-phishing, going after a particular target. Rather than send a broad message, I love when I get a message telling me that my account at the Royal Bank of Halifax, I need to change my password because I don't have an account at the Royal Bank of Halifax, so I can just laugh at it. But with spear-phishing, you learn something about your target. The HR person might like resumes. Researchers look at papers in their area. Use lures aimed at your target. A few years ago, I got emails purporting to be from my department chair or my dean, asking me to buy iTunes gift cards. They'll reimburse me later. There was notorious penetration of RSA Labs with a spreadsheet of hiring plans sent to somebody in HR. It went to the spam folder, but the HR person was very conscientious and retrieved the email from the spam folder and opened it. Very conscientious. It infected the whole company, probably sent by an intelligence agency. And today's high-end attackers are very skillful and have vast resources. They're often intelligence agencies. Spear-phishing works better if you know a lot about the target, but lesser threats are still serious when employed by skilled agents. I mean, you've got some really complicated exploit. Why use it against a target that will fall for a simple one? And it turns out these days that even less developed countries can rapidly build up sophisticated military hacking skills. So much so that even the New York Times has taken notice, article the last couple of years about how rapidly Iran and North Korea have come up to speed. And no one figured that North Korea was going to, because they're not on the internet. Where were their people learning their skills? Well, there's enough information out there. It doesn't take too much. So a lot of countries have developed fairly sophisticated, quite sophisticated military hacking skills. Of course, the operating systems have improved. Today's defenses are quite good, albeit not perfect. 15 years ago, buffer overflows were at least half of all attacks. Technology stopped most of that. We've got things like stack canaries and so on. Stops stack-based buffer overflows in its tracks. But we now have things like return-oriented programming and other code reuse attacks. The attackers aren't going away. You're not going to stop today's sophisticated attackers with one technological fix. You will find one fix and they'll find another hole. Just today, I read a story about from a report out of Google's Project Zero, talking about the zero-day attacks, ones for which no patch exists. Most of them they found were quite easy to find, took a very little effort to find these holes. There were only two they found that were sophisticated, and those came from a Israeli company called NSO. But today's exploits are multi-stage because we've got multiple layers of defense. You get a beachhead, for example, infect a browser. But today's browsers are sandboxed. So the next step is to find another exploit that lets you escape the sandbox on that platform. And then you do privilege escalation, become root or administrator on that machine. A penetration then is chaining together multiple vulnerabilities to penetrate a system. But this is not imaginary. This is what's happening in the real world today. And, you know, there's a saying I've heard attributed to submariners that there are two kinds of Navy vessels, submarines and targets. The internet has become a target-rich environment. It's other countries' government and military infrastructure. It's other critical infrastructure like the power grid and the water supply system. Well-placed monitoring points, though that I might add is not new. In 1993, there was a CERT advisory about password monitoring on the internet. Well, the attackers then were able to, based on the topology of the time, were able to plant their password monitoring technology on machines that were on the internet backbone. Way to construct a new operating system secure by its nature? Probably not. One reason is backward compatibility is all about the applications. And a high percentage of security problems are not in the code, they're in the specs. You know, using a memory safe language will get us a lot of the way there, but it's not going to help you against a bug in the spec. You know, about once every 3 to 4 or 5 months, I see a flaw that relies on someone going after specifying a path name of .. // whatever / password. That's not a new attack. I was certainly aware, personally was aware of that in 1979. It still happens today. It's not just the operating systems. One of the mistakes that we made, a wrong turn that we made in the early 80s, I'd say through the 90s, was the assumption that all that mattered was operating system security. That's good, that's important, but it's application security that matters. To me, a secure operating system is one that makes it easy to write secure applications, but nothing's perfect. So Windows 11 is extraordinarily secure. This month's Patch Tuesday had 145 flaws, 10 of them critical, one of them being actively exploited. And this is despite almost 20 years of Microsoft software development lifecycle. It's a hard problem. But attackers going after defense contractors, commercial technology, personal information database. When Equifax was hacked about 5 years ago, probably by an intelligence agency, stole data on 150 million Americans. Office of Personnel Management, tens of millions of federal employees, including information on people with security clearances. Dissidents, more or less anything else imaginable, is being targeted today. And even the ordinary thieves are better. Why steal credit cards one number at a time, say with a keystroke logger, when you can hack a server and steal 50 million at a time, as happened to Target and Home Depot? We're seeing massive thefts of information. Marriott and Quora have disclosed massive breaches of hundreds of millions of users' data taken. Marriott, it took them 4.5 years to notice the problem. There's a line attributed to the famed bank robber, Willie Sutton. He never actually said it. Why rob banks? That's where the money is. Why hack computers on the internet? That's where the information is. Phishing, we know how to defeat. You can use two-factor authentication. Corporations have used this for a very long time. Cheswick and I discussed this in '94. Consumers are starting to use it too. Phones have become the most common second factor because almost everybody's got a smartphone. It could be via an app, which is reasonably secure, or a text message, not nearly as secure, but far better than just a password. The best technology out there today is probably a FIDO2 key, because that authenticates the actual endpoint cryptographically, but those are still not that common. Patching has grown up too. Microsoft and Google, at least in the consumer space, don't wait for users to download patches. They push patches out to their users. But some of these patches still break things. Corporations are realizing the importance of speedy patching. It's hard to patch when you're a corporation because you've got custom software that the patch couldn't have been tested against, and it might break. But many corporations have development and deployment styles that are amenable to rapid patching. Like Checkpoint, you snapshot your virtual machine, do the patch, spin up a new VM, and if it breaks something, then you can revert to the earlier snapshot. Equifax was hacked because they had, if I recall correctly, 117 web servers, and 116 of them were patched. Well, the attackers found the 117th. So where are we today? Today, we're getting dual threats: hostile militaries and ransomware. A major plague of ransomware. Ransomware attackers will encrypt your files and sometimes your online backups. Hint, keep at least one backup offline. And they demand payment in cryptocurrencies, preferably the untraceable variety. And since some companies say, I have a good backup, I'm not going to pay you, they're coupling it with extortion. We're going to publish your sensitive files and not just rely on decryption. Healthcare facilities, municipal governments have been highly targeted by a lot of these ransomware operators. And over the last couple of months, we're seeing cyber weapons used in support of an actual real military operation. Russian military intelligence apparently used a variety of cyber weapons before and during their attack on Ukraine. They apparently knocked out some satellite terminals, not the satellite, the ground terminals across Europe, because the Ukrainian military was using these satellites to communicate. They've been going after the Ukrainian power grid. Again, the Ukrainians have so far managed to fight that one off. And the Ukrainians are not standing still. They've got their IT army, they're calling it, and a lot of sympathizers around the world who've been striking back at Russian companies and assets. And there's a lot of concern about Russian hackers, whether it's directly Russian intelligence or Russian criminals who are encouraged or tolerated by the Russian government to strike back at the West because of the sanctions and the military aid being given to Ukraine. So when it comes to cyber warfare, this is actually a fairly delicate time, and we don't know where this one's going. This hasn't happened before. And by the way, I apologize for the picture of the bear. This was Mount Rainier. It was misting. So those little white spots are raindrops. So where do we go in the future? Is there hope, or are we going to climb deeper out of the swamp? Formal methods of security are showing some promise. It's not, formal methods, people have been talking about them since before I started graduate school, and that's a very long time ago at this point. But we're able to apply formal methods to more and more systems, larger and larger systems. Agile development, agile deployment is allowing rapid testing and deployment. And today's large-scale systems involve many replicas. So you try out your attack. You try out your defense on a few replicas at a time and see what happens. If it doesn't work, you shut them down and spin up new virtual machines with the older system. How do cyber weapons work? No one answer. It depends on what the target is. When Russian military intelligence, the GRU, went after the Ukrainian power grid in 2015, it was an industrial control system. They could flip relays, flip switches, strip breakers to take the thing offline, take the power grid offline. Stuxnet worked by changing speeds on the centrifuges, driving out of spec and causing the centrifuge eventually to self-destruct. If it's a banking system, you might just go erase the entire disk. There was Typhoon, which went after an oil company in Saudi Arabia, and it tried to override the safety systems on the pipelines and refineries to cause the physical infrastructure to self-destruct. So there are a lot of different ways. It's especially serious when there's physical infrastructure controlled by computer, but destroying, wiping disk on a satellite ground station, you might have to roll a truck to fix that, and that knocks that communication out. So there's not one answer to what a cyber weapon is. It depends on what system it's going after and what it's targeting. Which raises interesting questions. If most of the targets on the internet are civilian, should the military defend the civilian parts of the net? I have a lock on my door. If somebody breaks in, I can call the New York City Police Department. But, I can't defend against hostile tanks and bombers. Do we want the military to try to defend a civilian part of the net? There are privacy issues. And sometimes attribution gets wrong, is wrong. And a lot of people don't trust the government with data, and they keep trying to mess with our cryptography. Internet of Things is a real threat today. Again, we have developers who aren't hardened to security, repetition of old mistakes. There's not an economic model for patching on devices that have outlived their support lifetime, and you get physical world consequences. We know how to solve Cliff Stoll's password problem. Password managers and two-factor authentication, but deployment's a challenge. We have more serious attackers. We can patch, but not for IoT. We have more information sharing among the defenders. There's still a buggy code problem. Attribution is hard, though sometimes possible. Usability is still a real concern. And Morris identified this around 86, 87. So are we climbing out of the swamp? I won't try to go through this chart for you right now. I think the situation has improved, but we have more serious attackers. And with that, I leave you for any last questions.
On behalf of the ACM Baltimore chapter, Steve, we extend our appreciation to you for your delivering invited talk, ACM Baltimore chapter inaugural seminar 2022, Lawrence, Maryland, April 20th, 2022. Thank you so much for your talk.